Hey there, listeners, and welcome to Project Zero, where we hear about the journeys of some of the best project leaders in the game. My name is Alex Tuck, and I'm the host. This week, we have a special episode that takes you behind the scenes of a series that we produce called Project Management for Small Business. Every month, we publish new content that helps project managers that are looking for a lightweight solution to project management that boils out the essentials of what smaller organizations need. We found that most project management content out there is geared towards PMs that are building bridges or rockets. But we're all working on smaller projects, things like rolling out a CRM for a 15-person team. In this episode, I'm joined by Galanda Brooker, Jessica Carisse, and Alex Morgan, where we discuss the basics. What does a project manager of a small team need to think about for every project that they tackle? If you're interested in checking out our other project management resources for smaller organizations, be sure to go to our website, tuckconsultinggroup.com, and you'll find project management for small businesses under our resources. We hope you enjoyed this episode. What do you think the main things are that you should focus on as a project manager? Thinking about small business or maybe that small department, like that, what are the basics for service delivery that you think each group needs?
Communication plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I always say that first because no matter what the size, if you're not properly informing the team members and all the relative stakeholders, it doesn't matter how great the service is going to be or the tool is going to be if you have not communicated. And communication doesn't start when it's time to use it. You got to prep them. So you got to do like pre-communication, communication all along the process. And then it's almost like being a cheerleader, right? You're hyping them up about it. It's coming. It's good. It's going to be all these things for you. And this is what we're doing. So that by the time it is ready to be delivered, they're more open to it. They're excited about it and they want to participate.
Let's talk about cadence and ways of communication, right? Should we have a Teams chat once a week? Should we have a status meeting? Should we have an email that goes out? I know you're going to say it depends on the client, but let's talk about what that process looks like and what has worked for some folks and what hasn't.
That's great. I was just having the same conversation actually with one of the recent interviewees about what's necessary, what's the base requirements for a successful project. And a lot of it, ultimately, like you're saying, a lot of boils, maybe not down to communication, but they are fundamentally communicating information either from stakeholders and into the center or reverse. Typically, I'd say we got to work with what the client has available if we are providing our own tools, but at a bare minimum, the things that need to be communicated on a regular basis or the status of the project as a whole, things like hours and budget and notifying teams of risks and issues, and then any kind of other major metrics that are being stated up front. So if that's perfectly viable to convey in a simple email or a document, or if it's just going internal and there isn't really a client presentation aspect or presenting to leadership aspect, then you can go very simple, obviously. But I'd say what is going to be actually read and actually ingested successfully by the people who need to see it. So if that means you have 4 people on the team and all they do is read emails and they don't ever check Teams or they don't want to get on calls or whatever the case is, then an email will suffice as long as you can rely on them to read it. If it's something where it's better to present to them in person in a status call or make it something like a dashboard or a more formatted PDF, depending on the requirements of the client, I think that would also be called for. But typically having a conversation with the team up front, figuring out who those stakeholders are, who needs to know what and how they're actually going to be able to receive it effectively for their own role or type.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I would also add too, as a project is progressing, that I think it's really important because I'm not a person who likes meetings. I think we all can agree on that. But I do believe it's important to have a live verbal meeting no less than every other week. I know every week can be a lot, but at least every other week. So even if they're not reading the information that you're saying, you have a live meeting where you're communicating, summarizing that to reinforce what you've already sent in other kinds of written communication. So I think it's important to have live meetings at least every other.
I have all these clients who say they love asynchronous communication. They always like to cancel, but guess what? They are never getting stuff done. Everyone does this like magical thing. Magically, everything's done either the day before or potentially like the hours before the status meeting. Every single time. I almost lean towards having a weekly status and then canceling if you don't need it, or just having it on the books just to spend 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes max, just to check on stuff, check on how things
Yeah,
are going. That's when the
definitely.
risk issues come out.
I do think having it on the books is helpful. And like you said, we can cancel it if need be, but just emphasizing that no less than this amount live communication. But,
Yeah.
15 minutes once a week, 15, 20 minutes once a week generally is not going to throw too many people off. Scheduling can be done.
It serves two purposes. One, it's obviously got a good motivator for people to do what they needed to do. It gives them opportunity to talk about other things that aren't maybe just status related. And it keeps momentum going on the project, which I think is really one of the biggest drivers. And kind of what I was saying, it's almost guaranteed that they're going to ingest the information if you're sitting with them on a call talking to them. So it's at least, it's a feel safe at worst, where you're saying, I need to get this to you. Here's how we can do this every week. If you prefer, we can work asynchronously, but it's a two-way street and obviously requires the effort.
So speaking of service delivery and statuses and stuff like that, how do you like to organize the artifacts from an engagement? We're consultants, right? But if you were consulting an individual company that was running projects, right? How would you have it organized? Do you have a plan to transition from project into operations? Do you store that information in the functional area? How do you like to operate?
I always try to transition to operations, just simply because most of the projects I have is to improve operations. So that means there is going to be a team that manages the day to day. For example, doing like a centralized application monitoring project, right? So we have the scope of the applications we want to monitor, why we want to monitor them, how we're going to monitor them, what's being monitored depending on the type of technology being used in that software. But then as it relates to like the operational aspect of it, it's okay, who are the stakeholders that are responsible for these applications, and then making sure that type of information is updated, because you don't want reference or key contact materials to go stale. So it'll be those like, okay, how do we keep our information clean? How do we make sure that whatever we install doesn't go sour, go stale? And then making sure that whoever is maintaining that, like it's maybe just an admin perspective, they're informed of it, they're trained on it, and they know how to troubleshoot and then go from there.
Cool. Like that. Is there a best practice way that you like to see projects, document repositories stored? Is there an organizational style that you have or that you would recommend, or process that you would then take that and move it to operations?
I have thoughts about how I would set it up from a tool perspective.
Yeah, I'm looking with the clients that I've had, I'm inquiring about where things are accessed early on and trying to incorporate that as part of the project so that there's not too much of a transition to operations. You don't want to put it in a separate kind of space and then have to move it. So you do an inquiry about where are you accessing documents now? How are you accessing documents now? What is the protocols around that? And then you try to fit it in that. In some cases, an organization does have a document best practices or document governance, and sometimes they don't. And so if it's the case that they do not, then, we recommend a hierarchy for it, whether it be in a specific tool. I generally suggest that if they have network attached storage, because that's something that's backed up, they can control access and security to things very easily, that I give some kind of design in that space. So inquiring, how is it accessed currently? will that type of action still continue, and then incorporate that into the project plan so that they have very little transition once the project is finished, because it's already where they're familiar with or where we're planning to transition them to go anyway.
What Galana said, I think having the operations already in mind, I think that's probably what I was referring to as well, because it's not a whole big new thing. Okay,
Right.
this is just
In cases where we're dealing with no data, basically, like you just take along today, small businesses, nonprofits, frequently, we have no structure, we have no library, et cetera, et cetera. I think to that, and again, it's it's about where they're going to be able to access it easily, and where they're, if it's proximate to the work, that makes sense in operations, and it's not just pulling things out of thin air. The only piece I would add to that is, as you know, especially because again, we're often slotting into an existing library or an existing knowledge base and not rebuilding it. So in those cases, working within their existing system and providing as many opportunities to kind of shortcut and backlink and give the documentation a direct access point from where the work is being done, because presumably they know where their information is stored as well, but the faster they can get to it, to one, update it right on a regular basis, and to double check things, I think the more usable it is for sure.
Yeah, I like that. So again, related to service delivery, one of the components is like building out a project plan. There's 1,000 different ways that you could do this. There's waterfall and agile and hybrid and all these other things. Let's talk first about some pretty standard project, like some sort of server migration or something like that. How you would approach building out that project plan. When do you build it out? Who do you involve with that? And how do you iterate on that over time?
let's say it's a server migration. Typically, I like to start with a project charter before a project plan, to put some guardrails around what we're doing with this server migration. Is it one site that we're doing, multiple sites? What are the risks that we need to keep in mind? What's the reason why we're doing this? Because if we're just migrating servers just for fun and not maybe for a strategic growth, scaling, foundational type of project, those are two different things, and two different things you need to be mindful of. So if we're trying to scale for the next 15 years or something like that, okay, so you're going to need some research and making sure that you actually had the right proper sourcing procurement plan in place. And that's a whole other project. So if it's something that's more complex, you can identify that in the project charter. And then from there, you can make your complex project plan, because there's going to be a lot more steps that you'll need to do up front as far as research and impact, costs, all that thing, compared to when you actually do the implementation of it. So I think like for a server migration, it would be typically a more waterfall approach, just because it's more cut and dry. It's not like, what do we want to do? It's just a server migration. So I would do the waterfall approach for the first part of it. And then as they're actually implementing, that's probably do more Kanban, perhaps. So it'd be like a little bit of a split.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. And so one thing that I like to do is we'll meet with the team, like some of the core team members, and just hit the high level tasks that are going to be done, right? Like you were describing, just like the procurement of the servers or the cloud contract or whatever it is. And then maybe we label all the servers and maybe the different functional applications that are on those things, blah, 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 blah. And then those are super high level. But then there's like the actual, like, all right, now we're going to plan this, prep the server, cut over, do all those things. And we don't necessarily need to build all those things out at the beginning, right? So as we progress through the project, maybe we hit a milestone and then boom, we'll start decomposing some of those items, right? And I think that decomposition into something that's achievable within a time box period, like 1 hour, 4 hours, something like that, is where you want to get to, but not necessarily where you want to be at the beginning. But it all depends. It just depends on what your style is as a project manager.
Jessica's point about the project charter is really important, because I was sitting here thinking about a client where it was supposed to be a data migration. And that was the project plan, to move the data. But in fact, it was a data migration and the SharePoint environment build. The SharePoint build was nowhere in the project plan. So had there been a project charter that outlined that, the approach would have been different than how it was presented. So I think the charter having that high level scope, which would have included that, right? The objectives of that, why are we doing this? It would have saved the client some time and money and made their implementation with more ease than what it ended up being.
Something that's generally not contained anywhere except for the scope of work, the why we're doing this, for everybody involved to have their head around the point and not just get stuck in the weeds. And so many questions of, is this going to work or is this going to work? If you just remember the point, like literally why we're doing it, of course, there's so many obvious cases.
Yeah.
But also, maybe it's a 15-year plan, maybe it's something else. We're typically starting from the scope of work, the contract, or the requirements have hopefully been laid out for us and at a base level, a way to orient ourselves around what the goal of the project is, of course. Obviously, that's not always so cut and dry, Galanda. Not every scope of work is going to be perfect, and there's definitely a discovery to be had to really hash out the final details. I think the way that you were both approaching it, you start from there, then you dig further and deeper into the granular areas, and that requires leveraging the expertise of the technical team and the people with historical knowledge, et cetera. As PMs, you've done server migrations before, so you know what those steps look like, and that's super helpful. If these are just generic widgets, then we're obviously leaning on those technical folks more and more, but it still follows that same process. And I think the part that's seemingly hardest is really, at least in our experience, I can say build set up the configuration for all of the certain server software. If you haven't done it before, that might be a very difficult task to estimate, but getting it from the highest level to knowing where you need that granular level of this is a task for 4 hours and I'm going to put it on my calendar. That's its own exercise. And it can be somewhat flexible depending on the team and the approach. It doesn't have to be too waterfall, but knowing that you need to build it into something that can be time boxed to make sure that you'll be able to drive accountability from the people doing the work and be able to forecast, really understand how that estimated budget or whatever approach applies to the work itself. And then forecast, is this on time? Is this on track? If you don't have the actual wheels to the ground task level element there where you can say, this is how long it's going to take, and I know if I did it or not, then the plan is only broad strokes.
Let's talk a little bit about like risk and issue management. We talk about the different project managers love to say this, like the difference between a risk and an issue is that the issue already happened and a risk is something that might happen. And that's good education, right? Like good advice. And the other thing that people say is like a risk and an issue don't always have to be negative. They can also be positive risks and positive issues. So risk might be that your stuff comes in earlier on a construction project. Right? And so what would you do if that positive thing happened? Could you get more stuff done earlier? So anyway, those are like the two quips that like project managers will throw out there. But how do you all elicit risks and issues aside from just saying, hey, are there any risks and issues that anyone has? Because that's what I used to do when I first started working in project management. I'm like, oh, well, they didn't raise the risks and issues, so it's not my problem. How do you all get those ideas out of your teammates?
I think you don't use the term risk or issue when you ask them. Like it's more like, what are the problems that you've been running into? Do you see any foreseeable things coming up that might hinder your progress? Like, don't use the term. Ask more clarifying questions that will pull it out of them. Because if you just say risk or issues, they're going to do like a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
Not really. But if you say something like, what are the problems that you guys ran into last week? They're your issues, right? Problems could affect the schedule next week. They're your risks, right? So you just ask the question without using that terminology to be
I like that.
Draw them out.
Yeah, I like that. Does anyone here use like the 5 whys?
Where you like basically ask someone why like 5 times and then you get to root cause of whatever, probably subconsciously, just because sometimes if someone is explaining something to me and it doesn't make sense, I will keep asking the question, but in a different way to make them think about it in a way they can explain where it makes sense to me. So I think because I'm naturally curious and I want to understand how someone thinks too. So I just inquire until I understand it. And then from my inquiry, they're like, oh, wait, I didn't think about things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then I'm like, all right, let me jot that down. So it's like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever try to repeat back to someone like what you think you heard, even though they didn't necessarily say that, and then they're like, "Oh shoot, that is the issue." I think that can be annoying to some people, especially if you don't do it right. But I feel like that's something I do a lot.
Yeah, the technique is called mirroring, and you're right. It depends on the person whether or not they like it. But sometimes you can get around it by just saying, "Well, this is what I understood you to say. Was this accurate? Is this what you meant to say?" Which is a form of mirroring, but not necessarily putting it on them. You're just like, "Oh, this is what I heard. Did I hear you correctly?" But even still, like you said, certain people don't care for it as
Yeah.
I hear it a lot.
But I mean, that's just being inquisitive, right?
To me now, but it's all, I think it's a good communication practice in general, because there's so many assumptions in all of communication, and that if you don't validate your assumptions, you're just setting yourself up for failure in a lot of cases. It actually just reminded me, you were saying about the 5 whys. I was at a driving range, Jessica, and I'm not a golfer, but I was just out hitting some balls, and I was like, what's causing a slice versus a draw? And my wife golfed a bunch, and she was explaining it in terms of like, your feet are not situated right. And I'm in my head, I'm like, no, I'm trying to ask about what the ball does. What is the ball doing differently? Is it turning one way or the other? And like, it almost became an argument because I was getting the wrong answer, but I couldn't say it in a way that sounded nice. You had exactly the right solution there, Jessica. It was from a curious point, but I just started off the wrong foot. So maybe I'll start at higher level and just dig deeper and deeper. Why? That'd be that approach, I think, is just knowing the root cause without driving. In case I'm like that, we're building accountability, but you're also just not driving people into a defensive position when they're, hey, why didn't you do it? The structure is there. You just don't say it in a harsh way. Just like you're saying, that mirroring those things is, you can do it casually.
So when you go PMI style risk and issue management, right? Like you have your risk and issue log, and then you're like, are we going to mitigate this risk or not? How are we going to mitigate it? Are we going to transfer the risk? Are we going to do all these things? And honestly, on a $250 million project, like it wasn't a bad idea, but mainly it was like an insurance plan, right? Like, hey, state of Vermont, you all agreed that we would transfer this risk using insurance, or we were going to accept this risk because of X, Y, and Z, and then you documented the heck out of it, right? But when you're a small business, I still see people using that technique, and it just feels like a cover your ass kind of thing. It's not really helpful. What's your take on it? Have y'all experienced this? How hard do you measure this stuff?
Definitely feels overkill, I'd say, for most of the projects we're on. It's risk mitigation. So, of course, in a sense, it's risk aversion. But I mean, really, like any of these artifacts or processes, I think of it as, what's the juice for the squeeze here? If this project goes haywire, we lose $10,000. That's not the end of the world versus losing $200 million, of course, or something like that. And what is the level of risk? And I think it's a good process still to be able to say more formally, not just log the risks, but no, is this something we're going to do something about? Or when do we actually have a threshold here? But ultimately, it's really still whether that risk is going to happen or not, and what are you going to do about it? And if it's things you can play by ear for smaller stakes, being flexible with the project team and whatever the sponsor's needs are, so that you're not bogging yourself down with 50 artifacts or 50 processes for things that you really need most of the time. So I do like the idea of explicitly, this is in emails, we said this happened here. Just like any other meeting note or something else, when you make a decision that's going to affect the future, it's helpful to have that written down somewhere. You can't just fly by your seat of the pants all the time and say, we talked about that risk and you said it was cool. Now the project's not. I think recording at the base level is necessary, and recording any decision made about it is necessary. And almost always tracking whether it needs to be followed up on. If you have a risk register, that's going to be part of the course, but making sure you're not just leaving it off to the side.
I mean, I think risk and whether you mitigate it or avoid it, there's some level of avoidance, right? So you have to also gauge, is it willful? Am I willfully am I just like head in the sand because they're overwhelmed, right? Type of situation. Is it I'm avoiding it because strategically, like you said, Alex, in some cases, it's best to just strategically just don't deal with it, transfer the risk elsewhere. And I think it's important to know what the avoidant tactic is for the risk that you're documenting, so then you can have better understanding of what then to do.
We actually keep it pretty simple on most of our projects, right? Where we have a weekly status report. In the status report, it's all right, here are all the open risks and issues that we have, of which there are like 2, 3 max, right? On most projects. And then even decisions, like we actually have a risks, issues, and key decisions section. And we just track the things that either need to be decided or managed. And then once it's done, it's done. I mean, it's historically in our old status reports, but we're not really stressed about it. We can always go back and look at it, but who cares at that point, unless we're trying to blame somebody, right? And what's the purpose of blaming anybody anyway? But
that's where it comes in. Just let it search the history instead of, you don't need to build a whole system that says, let me make sure this decision see when this decision was made and who made it so that I can remind them in the future. If there's a problem and it comes up, you don't need to spend a bunch of time setting it up in some of these cases. Right.
But even then, we've had clients where they're like, you guys said you would do this and then you did that. And it's like, but like, it doesn't even matter. The client's not happy. The client's not happy.
Yeah. We're not going to go back and have an argument. Unless we're going to court or the insurance claim or something, where I get to go back and argue with them about just the scope. Other than to say, hey, if there's a path forward, that's where it matters. Or we can agree to disagree or something. Depends on the level of risk. I think if it's worth noting, it's because it requires a decision to be made and requires a compromise of some kind or some trade-off, something you need to account for. And just knowing that you made that decision because it will affect future decisions at the bare.
I like the rule where it's like, all right, let's look back to learn from what we did, but that's it. That's the only reason why we look backwards, is to get better going forwards. Otherwise, it doesn't even matter. Yeah.
The ultimate really. It reminds me of actually, Alex, we were at the Vermont convening of consultants.
Convening, yes.
And I heard about it, but I never had gone through the exercise myself. And it was like similar to a risk setting or risk approach, but instead of goal setting, it was fear setting, and they're just identifying what are the worst possible outcomes and fears, or basically detaching your emotional assumptions about something, which can be applied to risk and products as well.
How do you negotiate and escalate as a project leader? Like, how do you get stuff done on your project while also respecting the fact that these people might have day jobs, that they have other projects they're working on, et cetera? Any techniques, tools?
This is where I really lean into the relationship aspect of things. You can't push people with force. You gotta literally step into their shoes. And then I would probably do one-on-one conversations with each of the leaders to understand why they don't want to do it. And then I'm going to have an honest conversation with the owner. Like, look, it's my job to report bad news to you. And this is what people are saying. And this is why, this is the impact. This is the perception. What can we do? Because most likely they may not have that information. And if they do and they don't care, then that's a different conversation.
But the first thing is the nature of the issue obviously will dictate largely. And in this case, this example case, having a direct line to the owner is very helpful, because then we have an escalation point, versus if we're onboarding somebody in a tool, who's our escalation point? Their manager or something at a much lower level. With the relationship, I think that's key. I mean, really, like anything else, it's always a relationship. You can't negotiate anything without some relationship. And if the relationship is like authority, the owner says to do it, maybe that works. Understanding what that looks like. Does that mean we need to reorient this project or this engagement? Is there sufficient sponsorship here to actually do this in the face of friction? Or is it an issue with the leadership and priorities or timing or something else? But I think the way you approach it, Jessica, is obviously you're very relationship focused, and it works very well. Coming from, there's a reason people do things, and the reason it's the weight of the authority behind the project that really matters, which is why we harp so much on the need for a project sponsor or leadership to be involved. Somebody needs to know this is important. It's not just us deciding, is that happening? But if we can't convey that authority effectively as individuals, or convey the kind of organizational authority driving the work, then people aren't going to be able to prioritize it when other things are also calling for their attention. I think that part, we need to work out with whoever is really driving these priorities, whether it's the team, the leader of the team, or the owner themselves. What really is your priority here? And we need to make a decision, or at least to make ranked choice voting or something along those lines, and say, what are we going to focus on? Can we carve out time for this? This needs to move forward. I think the hard part, in a lot of cases, it's not that clear. It's, why is this 2 weeks late? Or why didn't, you didn't report the status of this task that you needed to report on, or you're not responsive in these cases. And a lot of it, obviously, it's so much relationship depends on the person and how you can deal with them. In a remote world, it's pretty odd. I think even dragging somebody down to a one-on-one call to ask about the status of work can be tough, but recognizing that humanity comes first to a degree, and then really working out with who has some sway with this person or some sway with their workload. I think that's the more often the culprit. What else are they doing that we can talk through with someone else to figure out how to carve out time for this work? Assuming that that person is capable of doing it, all those other kind of constraints that we'll have to uncover in the process.
I think too, to add to what Jessica said, I want to bring in an additional layer of relationship, right? Like, you're leaning in, you're talking to the person, but also talking to the person in relation to the company mission, right? So if you're understanding the company mission, and this is what your organization is trying to do, and we have been tasked to do this, and you are refusing this, do you understand how your refusal affects the company mission, right? And sometimes that can sway the naysayer a bit to say, oh, wait a minute, I did commit to this mission. I do want to do this. I know I said no, but when you put it this way, when they can't be swayed in that way, where you can't tie the project back to the mission of the organization, that's when you have to deliver the bad news to the owner and say, hey, I spoke to them. This is what they said. We tied it back to the mission, and they still were like, no. But I think in addition to talking to them to really try to understand their perspective, if you can tie in what they're refusing or not being cooperative in doing to the mission, sometimes that can give you just enough nudge to get what's done, to get done, right? It doesn't always work, but it is a tactic that you can attempt to employ. I guess it's part of the negotiation, right? To get them to get on board. Because at that point, it's not me, it's not the project manager or the consultant against the internal people. It's the internal people against the mission of the company. You've taken yourself out of it, right? It's not what I do. The mission is this. And this is how what we're doing ties into the mission, and this is your part in it. So you kind of push it all back into their court in a way that it takes you out of it. Because sometimes it's just no, because you're an outsider. They just don't want to do what the consultant says because you're a consultant. But when you frame it in that way, it's a reframing technique, then it's all kind of internal. And then sometimes their objections don't stand up to that.
I don't think Jessica has a big problem of people not wanting to do whatever she says. Because
worst comes to worst, I'm like, come on, just help me out, please, man. Just help me out just this one time, please.
I use that. I use that all the time.
Good cop, bad cop. The bad cop is the business goal. If that's not motivating enough for you, then can you help me?
Just help me out, please.
I have to be honest, like
that works for the person too. I mean, it started with that same thing. There's a reason this person has a problem here, whether it's personal, whatever the case is. Like, can I help you work through that? When I'm not trying to be a therapist, but like, oh, you don't have enough time for this? Okay, let me figure out how to make time for you, or carve it out for you, or talk to your manager. It's not helping that. If they think you're helping them, they will help you. Yeah. And obviously, at some point, I think ultimately, everybody has free will even in business, and they can decide not to work. So if you can't motivate them, they can leave. You were saying, Yolanda, you can't successfully motivate them because if it's tied to the mission, that's one thing. If you can't tie it back to the mission, that's a project issue that you need to work out separately. You can still try it. Give them the goal, remind them how it's affecting the team or the organization or something else that's not just them. But everybody's a bit different in that, of course.
Telling their story. So helping them tell their story is the way that you can help them, help them achieve whatever you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. I mean, the original prompt here was escalation tactics. And I think these are ways that we can help negotiate the escalation point. finding out what the issue was up front. We can say, hey, if folks aren't giving us the data we need, maybe you're doing your work, but we need more than just the work itself. We need to know what's happened, and we need to be able to pull some numbers or things out of you to forecast to make your life hopefully easier. That part of it. If they, like you're saying, Alana, if, hey, we want to take this off your plate or make this simpler for you and make you not have to keep asking questions or us ask you questions, and that is beneficial to both of us. But if if you're time constrained, I think ultimately like work is time. We only have so much of it. If we have 50 extra things to do, then even the thing that's going to help us right now is hard to do. But we can step in and be that support structure, and that can really get us there. Ultimately, though, I think that we need to recognize when we can help them. There's a baseline here. So one of the cases involved in this client was they took like a week and a half random time off and they didn't have updates on their work that they weren't communicated in advance. So we were just kind of lost. We didn't know what was happening. And we didn't know how to get it otherwise. So we needed to escalate that immediately from the person who's EWOL to the manager, from the manager to really, hey, who has authority to contact this person and figure out how to carve up their day differently, not just get them to ask work, but say, hey, you have an entire other role that we need to either change or make sure that you are able to block time against. It took a while to get to that point, but really starting off of conveying urgency, I think, as the PM, ownership of the project. It's not just this person's not doing their job. It's we are trying to move this forward and I need this so that whether, you're here or not, I'm responsible for it. I think that goes a long way to assisting in the escalation to make it sure it's not just I'm marking on somebody for not working or whatever the case is. It's we're all in the same boat and there's one component that's not working right now. Let's figure this out.
For sure. Cool. All right. I think it's a wrap. Thank you for all your insights. All right. That is it. I hope you enjoyed the sneak peek behind the scenes of our Project Management for Small Businesses series. Again, you can go to our website, tuckconsultinggroup.com, and you'll find Project Management for Small Business under our resources navigation. Thanks to all of you who have joined us this week for Project Zero, and be sure to subscribe to Project Zero wherever you get your podcasts. We'll catch you next time with some great new insights from other project leaders. Have a great week.